So I have seen this sentiment echoed for quite some time now, and I've always been curious on why. Because to be honest, I have seen this exact same sentiment before with a different series, with Chainsaw Man. The problem with that is that I could never really find the perspective or the understanding on why people thought Chainsaw Man was corny, other than them just expressing how they felt. And that in itself is perfectly okay. It's entirely up to your own perspective, your own opinion, but for someone like myself, I've always valued that perspective or that opinion, another outlook on the story itself. So when I hear someone calling Chainsaw Man corny, or now respectfully Dandadan being called corny, I'm curious on where they get that from. How have they interpreted the story to see it that way? And it's not to shut them out or disrespect their opinion or to say that they're wrong, because they're entitled to how they feel. I'm curious on the why or the how. Personally, I don't see Dandadan being corny. It may be on the nose within a lot of different aspects, but corny seems almost berating, almost disrespectful. Like it's an insult to the author and to the work itself by calling it that. So I thought to kind of understand this perspective a little bit better, or at least try to, I'd go through some of the main components of the story to figure out where it may or may not be corny orientated, where that attention or idea actually comes from. Plus it gives me an excuse to talk about Dandadan once again, because I love the story and I love talking about it. So with all of that, let's begin.
Hey, where the problem, man? I'm spinning on these parts like I'm a laundromat.
So to start this off, I have 3 different categories to help break this up, because to be honest, I could combine all 3 and it would be heavily convoluted. So to make it easier, we break it up into different segments and just focus, or at least try to, specifically on those components. And these 3 components would be concept, characters, and chaos. 3 things that definitely go hand in hand with each other, but broken apart might be a little bit easier to find where people are kind of led astray a little bit and find certain aspects or elements of these components quote unquote corny. So let's start with Dandadan's concept. So far we are 40 chapters within the story, and it has been a blast of an experience. Very fun, very enjoyable, and I've loved basically every moment for it. I look forward to reading it every single week, basically over everything else. And this isn't to devalue other series, but there's something special when it comes to Dandadan's weekly reading experience. This is an entirely different conversation in itself, but it's something that I feel like should be mentioned just for the video itself, because it's very valuable, it's very important. The thing that directly aids this is obviously the concept of the story. Originally, when you are creating a story, you're going to have some sort of overarching goal, something that feels one-to-one, that connects to the reader so they understand where the story is actually going and where it will end up. You don't always have to do this, but it's very nice to have those guidelines, those comfortable rails that people can hold on to when the story starts to get a little bit wonky. And I say wonky purposefully because a lot of stories won't just go straight down the path of following those main rails. They want to detour, they want to be experimental, they want to try new and exciting and different things. That's to be expected. So when you have that one-to-one goal, it's usually brought in right at the beginning of the story. Now obviously this completely depends on what type of story you're reading. If it's something serious and emotional and has nothing to do with battling or action or fighting in general, you're most likely not going to have any of that, because the main kind of appeal to a story like that is the one-to-one connection for characters, your emotional connection to these characters, their journey, their experiences, and how they express themselves. When it comes to battle manga or action manga in general, having that guideline helps because it makes for an overall direction for the story. So even if you do get lost, you can always come back to the idea that, well, this is where the story is going, I can hold on to that. Plus it's enticing, it's enjoyable. If there's like a really cool overarching premise, like I want to be this king, or I want to have this much power, or I want to be the strongest, or I want to save the world, it's always something super vague, but you know has to be built up towards it. So if that person wants to be the strongest, they have to train, they have to battle all these other people that are considered the strongest, they have to work their way there. And it creates this pretty standard formula, right? Dandadan doesn't actually have this, or at least in the same respected amount. And I think this is a blessing and a curse. So while it feels inherently like a battle or action manga, that you're used to, it doesn't have the same guidelines as one. It doesn't have this overarching narrative that is so empowering that allures you to the idea of continuing to read the story. What is Dandadan's overarching goal? Find the main character's balls. And when I say balls, I quite literally mean balls. Interpret that how you will, but for YouTube's sake, I'm just gonna say bouncing balls. This sounds like an extremely absurd concept, finding the main character's balls. It makes sense why it actually is here when you read this story, but as you can see, it's not as alluring as being the king or being the most powerful or conquering the world or saving the world. Nothing as grand as that. So this is not a guideline. There's no support rails here. So you now just know the point of the story, the purpose. And I feel like I can understand why people wouldn't kind of grasp onto this idea, because it's not the main propellant. It's not something that's going to make you continue to read the story every single week. Is the main character going to get his balls back? No. I have to find out this week? No. If anything, the story itself knows this and creates some of the most engaging or entertaining content within its singular chapters every single week. And that's what makes you read, which also doubles back onto why its weekly reading experience is one of the most enjoyable, at least for myself. A similar conversation can be had for Chainsaw Man. It's kind of almost identical, just with the overarching goal or point of the story being a little bit shifted and changed around. There isn't really one for Chainsaw Man either, other than kill the gun devil. But you don't know what the gun devil is, you don't know how powerful it is, you don't know what it takes to get to the gun devil, and when you actually get to that point, it's glossed over rather rapidly. It's because it never really was a purpose. It never really was the main intention for you to read. It was that one-to-one connection to characters. So while both stories, Dandadan and Chainsaw Man, play up as being a standard action battle manga on a week-to-week experience, it's anything but that. It's more closely attuned with a story that isn't those things because it doesn't focus on the same goals. Even after this brief conversation about Dandadan's concept, I don't think this is the main reason why people think it's corny. What I think it actually is something a lot more simplistic, and that it is the things that fill in the story, that fill in the concept, the curses, the folklore, and the aliens combined. It is a very odd choice of kind of components to fill in your concept. Having curses or spirits and folklore, which are kind of two different sides of the same coin, and then having aliens on top of that to play the other side, it's absurd. It's a thing you don't see all too often, but because these three individual factors are here and they are intertwined so heavily within the narrative and how it plays forward, you see so much creative juices flowing within the author's brain that you could never guess what is going to happen next. And some people aren't really comfortable with that idea, with not knowing what's going to come next. That may sound surprising, but it's quite a common thing where stories will play up in such a pretty lenient and straightforward way that it provides this level of comfort because you know where the story is somewhat going. You don't know the intricate details, you don't know what characters are going to appear or what shocking revelation is going to come true, but you know where it's going. If you were to ask me where Dandadan is going after this one situation that's currently happening within the story, I could not tell you. It could go to the moon in some way, shape, or form, and it would still make sense. It could go completely underground or a differing dimension of some sorts, and it would still make sense. So having this level of freedom is so creatively engaging and enticing, but for some, a little bit overwhelming, a little bit too much. And I understand that. When it comes down to being corny, however, I think it just boils down to the fact that these three components, the spirits, the folklore, and the aliens itself, are just so crazily over the top. Like currently at the moment, I'm watching a giant Mongolian deathworm fight humans. Prior to that, I just watched a bunch of naked men beat on the main cast of characters because they want to sacrifice the main cast of characters to the giant Mongolian deathworm. Hopefully that in itself is pretty self-explanatory. It's very wild, it's very chaotic, it's very over the top, and while it works for Dandadan's story, maybe it just doesn't work for you. Even looking at all of these things and trying to see it from another perspective, I can't really be comfortable in saying that it is corny in a good way or even a bad way, because I know for a fact that this author could take it so much further, that if they really wanted to make it corny, they could take it beyond the limits that you would ever expect. But everything at the moment, everything that has been played upon throughout the entirety of the story has made sense. It has had purpose, it has an explanation, it has a reasoning, it has value behind it, and some of that that value is inherently sad or emotional or super well put together and it's engaging. For me personally, concept-wise, as much as there is a lot of things here for it, I don't think we're going to get all too far with it in finding out whether it's corny or not because of it. So let's move on to the characters. To keep this short and simple, because there's not a whole lot of characters, I thought this would be the primary place for the idea of Dandadan being corny actually being born, because these characters are so very out there. Now I understand people don't like the tropey nature of this story with the love triangle or the growing love quad circle, whatever you want to call it, with all of these characters kind of feeling a certain type of way about each other, and while it is definitely there, it's not too much of a propellant as of yet. I think between the main character Ken and Momo, the intimacy between them, the relationship that they have and how they actually initially came together is very powerful. It created a bond between them. They've experienced this traumatizing event that has inherently intertwined their lives into one. These other characters that are coming in are being brought forward in a way that is to not only aid Ken and Momo in their endeavors, but also in a way where they uplift themselves. So even though they may see Ken or Momo as a romantic interest, it's not something that I think will be kind of make or break for the story to play upon. I, for example, who is a recent woman that got brought into this story, has found power within herself because of the situation or the story arc that she was placed within, and doesn't actually need anyone at her disposal to romantically fall back on. She can fall back on herself now because of the power that she upholds, but she's still going to be part of the main cast of characters because of that power. So while the two kind of intertwine pretty effortlessly, even if the romantic feelings don't play out properly, it's not going to break the story and fracture it into a whole different realm of impossibilities, if that makes sense. I think a lot of romantic stories rely on that one-to-one intimacy, that emotion, and if it doesn't actually play out, the story has to cut off that character to some extent. Even Jin or Gigi, one of the most recent characters, is the exact same way. You'll notice that the structure of Gigi is almost identical to Ai, and even with the most recent chapter, it kind of confirms that they're very similar to one another. And this is for the exact same reason that I just mentioned, that when, if ever, those romantic feelings actually get played upon, you don't have to cut off that character indefinitely because they're strong enough to fall back on what they've built within themselves, with what the story has actually provided. Obviously, this is interpretive to such an extent and can be played upon in many different ways. I'm not all too bothered with the romantic triangle or the kind of romantic square, if you will, that they have going on with all four characters, but I think maybe personality people might find corny as well. I think that's kind of the whole thing with Dandadan's characters, is that they're very obnoxious, they're very over the top. Personally, I actually love this about Dandadan's characters. I absolutely enjoy it because, for one, it actually feels kind of genuine. Like, yes, it is over the top, but seeing characters jump back and forth between being super serious and then super sad or super worried or super concerned, then even comedic in a sense, to then having that being completely overwritten and influenced by another character's presence on the situation is entirely real. It makes a whole lot of sense, and while it is dialed up to 10, you never really know what you're going to get with the characters, how they're going to act. Even though some of them fall down a tropey mindset, it's dialed up to such an extent where it's completely unpredictable. There's enough there to comfortably predict how they may react, but still so much unknown to them that makes you want to learn about their characters even more. And the interaction between all of them feels so genuine. That's one of the biggest things for Dandadan, what it has going for it, alongside a litany of other things, but its character interaction, the emotion that they show to one another is so influential. It is so engaging to read these characters talk, speak, argue, fight, whatever it may be, because it's just fun. It's entertaining. It feels like an over-exaggerated real conversation. These characters are shy, they're quirky, they're timid, they're romantic, they're angry, they're justified in how they feel, and all kind of shows in this overly expressive way that feels just fun to read. And maybe within there, I can see why people would think that's corny, because you're not necessarily used to that. I would say a portion of that mindset goes to characters, but the one that I think kind of wraps everything together and really throws people for a loop is the final component, which is chaos. A lot of you know that I love chaos within storytelling, within manga specifically. You also know how much I appreciate it and kind of talk about how difficult it is to write because, you know what? It is very difficult to write. I would say that chaos is so difficult to write that if you do not understand what you are writing, what type of chaos you want to produce within your story, you will lose everything. You will turn your story into the most ficklest of things that could be read. And as self-destructive or disappointing this may sound, unfortunately it's just the case. To bring us some obnoxious Morpheus quote, chaos is like fire. It's very uncontrollable, but with enough attention to it, with enough reinforcement, with enough structure, you can control that fire. You can limit it. You can wield it even. You can understand it. You can play around with it and build upon it at your heart's desire, but within the limitations or the boundaries that you have set. When you have these rules, when you have this architecture that conforms around chaos, you can create a very engaging story, one that is completely unrivaled to anything that you would read after it because of how chaotic this story actually is. This isn't anything new. This isn't a revolutionary brand new thing that manga has just recently introduced. This isn't the case. But the example I can give you is Chainsaw Man, because it's done it on such a high level with so much efficiency in front of so many people's eyes, and it has captured the heart of the world. There's a reason why you read Chainsaw Man and Weekly Shonen Jump and think this probably shouldn't be in here, because not only can you read it two different ways, but the chaotic nature for it is not something Weekly Shonen Jump has produced. It's not something they have promoted. They don't go back to their authors or their editors and be like, let's make this chaotic, let's make this crazy and completely unpredictable. I feel like throughout the years they may have tried to do it, but once again it goes back to the difficulty of being able to wield that chaos. Chainsaw Man so far within Weekly Shonen Jump has been the only series to do it, and to do it to such a level and extent that feels absolutely perfect. Dandadan is the newest addition, not within Weekly Shonen Jump, but within Jump Plus, but is playing and capitalizing on it even further. And this makes so much more sense when you find out that Yuki Tatsu, the author of Dandadan, was an assistant to Fujimoto. So they worked on Chainsaw Man a little bit. They worked on Fire Punch. They have quite literally inherited this style of storytelling that Fujimoto has and created their own version of it. So while Dandadan stands right next to Chainsaw Man when it comes to wielding this chaos, it's its own. It's different. It's not within the shadow of Chainsaw Man, but it stands out on its own 2 feet, and it has done so in a very enjoyable and respectful way. This chaos does not work for a lot of people. A lot of the times it is not comfortable to read because there's so much, so new, so many, so intricate, so high level and low level things that are going on. A lot of people can't wrap their heads around one thing they feel comfortable with. So it's overwhelming. It's kind of even scary to read. You have all of these things thrown at you, but you don't have enough time to latch onto one thing that you find enjoyable. You mix that with the over-the-top, obnoxious, but very entertaining characters that you talk about. You mix that with the concept of the story itself and the over-the-top, overwhelming curses, folklore, spirits, and aliens alike, and you have a story that potentially you can't keep up with, that you just don't really know on where you want to put your attention. But you know it's not bad. You know it's wielded with purpose. You know it actually has structure and finesse within it, but you're just potentially not accustomed to chaotic storytelling, which is perfectly fine. Or maybe you think that it's bad or unenjoyable or it's the worst thing that you've ever read, and that's perfectly fine too. That's entirely your opinion. That's entirely your interpretation. You have the right to feel like that. But for the off chance of saving people, because I believe this story is really good, I believe it's very enjoyable, it has a plethora of things that you can fall in love with, and something that feels new, something that is a completely unique experience to itself and closest to Chainsaw Man. If you do think this story is corny, or if you're on the fence with it, take your time with it. Maybe try to experience other chaotic storytelling or stuff that is maybe out of your comfort zone. I think a lot of people instinctively start to compare it to other stories within the medium, which I honestly can't blame you. It's kind of a normal thing for people to do nowadays. But if you disconnect from that idea, if you are within a specific mindset that you feel like you want to take on something that is just fun and chaotic and all over the place, you might find yourself actually really falling in love with it. I understand it's not for everyone, and I understand even if you do those things, you may not like it, you may still hate it, but I don't necessarily think it's corny. If it is corny, it's corny in all the right ways. It feels new, it feels intuitive, it feels interesting, it's engaging, it hits every single note that you would want from a story. Even the deep, dark, and depressing stuff has recently started to trickle in within Dandadan, which is something that I've personally been waiting for quite some time, to have that sense of quote-unquote duality, because that is one of the most powerful things within chaotic stories, having this chaos with a deep, dark, depressing backbone to it. Dandadan didn't really have much of that deep, dark, depressing backbone, but it's starting to trickle into it. It first happened with I, which was an incredible story, but very just on the surface, more of a teaser of what was coming, and as of recently, it's shown a more visceral and darker version of it. So to bring this all to a conclusion, is Dandadan corny? For me, personally, no. Within the three components that I've mentioned, concept, characters, and chaos, there is quote-unquote corny elements within it, and I could understand why people would feel comfortable calling the story corny, but more so in a fun way. If I were to ever call it corny, it would be in vain of being good, that it's fun, that it's enjoyable, that it's an experience. But the way I personally seen people using it, it was to interpret it in a bad way, that it was ridiculous, that it was boring, that it was too much. I don't think this is true. I think it's an odd exaggeration for what the story actually is. And once again, people have the right to feel how they want to feel. So I'm not trying to change your perspective. I'm just trying to understand. But if you do feel interested in trying Dandadan again, or maybe you feel like your own perspective was a little bit too harsh or something along those lines, by all means, try it out again. Except this time, put yourself in a position that you may feel more comfortable with it. Chaotic storytelling definitely isn't for everyone, but it is something that you can fall in love with very quickly at a snap of a finger, at a blink of an eye. And Dandadan is all of that wrapped into one enjoyable, over-the-top chaotic experience, and one that I recommend for absolutely everyone to at least give it a try and to see how you feel about it. Endtime. So welcome to the end of the video. If you have made it this far, thank you very much. I appreciate you. I apologize for this video being so long. I did not mean for it to be this long. I am very passionate about Dandadan. I really enjoy talking about it. So what I want to know from you is, how do you feel about Dandadan? Do you feel like corny is the right word to describe it? Maybe over the top would be a little bit better, maybe overwhelming, chaotic even. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can feel about a story like Dandadan, but corny in a disrespectful way just doesn't seem like one of them. But I would love to hear how you feel about Dandadan within the comment section below. But with that, I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Leave a like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Drink plenty of water, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.